Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, ready to dive into some history. Today we're tackling the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Big moment in American history,
It's
right?
absolutely a landmark achievement.
And our source material for this deep dive is an episode from the Mr. Hutchings History podcast. It's episode 49, titled The Civil Rights Act of 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson's Legacy and the Path to Equality. Really fascinating stuff.
I agree. It's packed with insights.
We'll uncover the whole story behind this act, from the activists to the politics, all of it. But one thing that really stuck out to me was, Lyndon B. Johnson, a Southern Democrat championing civil rights. Doesn't quite add up, does it?
It's definitely a contradiction on the surface. You'd think someone with his background, Texan, former Senate Majority Leader, deep ties to the South, he'd be the last person pushing for racial equality. But that's what makes Johnson such a compelling figure in this story.
For sure. So to kick things off, let's set the scene a bit. Early 1960s, right? Intense activism, this growing urgency for racial justice, the Birmingham Campaign, just horrific images of police brutality against peaceful protesters, and of course the March on Washington King's I Have a Dream speech. Iconic. These events, along with all the work by groups like the NAACP, put immense pressure on the Kennedy administration.
Oh, absolutely. You had figures like A. Philip Randolph, the labor leader, and Roy Wilkins from the NAACP. They were relentless. They knew direct action combined with lobbying. That was how to force the government's hand.
Like a high-stakes game, every move pushing civil rights forward.
Perfect analogy. And it worked. Kennedy introduced a civil rights bill in '63 in response to that pressure, but instantly, fierce opposition, mostly from Southern Democrats, determined to keep segregation in place.
So it wasn't just about getting the president on board. This whole complex, hostile political landscape they had to navigate.
Exactly, in an uphill battle from the start. And then, Kennedy's assassination, November '63.
Wow, the nation must have been reeling. But it also meant passing the Civil Rights Bill. That now fell to Lyndon B. Johnson.
It did, and Johnson himself, when he became president, he said, "I knew the only real chance I had to be president was to get elected as a Southerner and a Democrat, and I did. And they killed the only man who could have elected me president, so I'm not going to let them down. I'm going to be the best president I can be for all the people."
Powerful words. He felt this duty to carry on Kennedy's legacy.
Yeah.
But still, his Southern background and this commitment to civil rights, was there some specific turning point for him?
Well, the podcast highlights a story about Johnson's cook, Zephyr Wright. She'd been working for him for years, and on one road trip with him, she experienced firsthand the humiliation of segregated facilities. It really affected Johnson deeply.
Makes you wonder, had he truly grasped what segregation meant before that?
It seems seeing Wright's experience was a real eye-opener for him. He reportedly told an aide, "When I was growing up, Zephyr was the one who took care of me. She was the one who made sure I had clean clothes and a hot meal. And now here I am, the most powerful man in the world, and I can't even ensure that she can use a decent restroom when we travel together."
That's a heavy realization. So personal conviction, sense of duty, seems like that fueled his push for the Civil Rights Act.
Absolutely. He saw it as honoring Kennedy and creating this great society he envisioned. No more poverty, no more racial injustice. But he knew it wouldn't be easy.
I bet. So let's talk about those challenges. This bill aiming to reshape America, how did it actually get through Congress?
Well, Johnson faced major pushback, mostly from those Southern Democrats. They saw the Civil Rights Act as like a direct threat to their way of life, and they were ready to pull out all the stops to kill it, including the filibuster.
Now, for those of us who aren't Senate procedure experts, what exactly is it, a filibuster, and why was it such a hurdle here?
Sure. So in the Senate, a filibuster. It's basically a way to just talk nonstop, refuse to yield the floor, and delay or even kill a bill. It takes a supermajority to break it, which is tough to get. And these Southern senators, they were ready to talk this Civil Rights Act to death.
So Johnson's facing this massive roadblock. What was his strategy?
He went all in, basically, calling in favors, twisting arms, making personal appeals to senators, both sides of the aisle. The podcast describes him as relentless, working nonstop behind the scenes to build support.
Sounds like a true political fighter.
He was. And at the same time, you still have the civil rights groups pushing hard. Groups like CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They're organizing protests, voter registration drives, keeping the pressure on, showing how much public support there was.
So is this two-pronged approach, Johnson's maneuvering Andy, the movement's pressure, that's what started to change things?
Exactly. Plus, you can't forget the impact of Kennedy's assassination. The nation's grieving, and there's the sense that passing the act, it would be a way to honor Kennedy's legacy.
Like this wave of momentum finally confronting the nation's past, right?
Absolutely. And Johnson was smart. He tapped into that, framed the bill not just as law, but as a moral necessity, a way to heal, move towards a better future.
The podcast also mentions Everett Dirksen. He was key.
Oh, yes. Dirksen, the Republican minority leader in the Senate, his backing was huge E. He was the skilled speaker, respected within his party. When he endorsed the bill, it brought a lot of Republicans on board.
Interesting. This landmark act needed both parties to get it done.
It shows how complex the issue was, more than just Democrats versus Republicans. This was about America's core values, what kind of nation it wanted to be.
And Johnson somehow bridged those divides.
He did, and the podcast mentions how he appealed to some Southerners on economic grounds, argued that ending segregation would actually HELP their economies. More workers, a bigger integrated workforce.
Pragmatic approach, finding that common ground.
Definitely. And he worked closely with Senator Hubert Humphrey, a big civil rights advocate. They strategized together, rallied support, a powerful team.
All this work, lobbying, activism, the politics, it finally led to that filibuster ending, a record-breaking one at that.
Must have been tense in that chamber when they finally voted.
I can only imagine. And then, July 2nd, 1964, Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law. Turning point in history. And this wasn't just symbolic. This act had teeth.
Right. It banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. In so many areas. Public places, jobs, federally funded programs.
Just enormous change, hard to overstate its importance. But I'm curious, what were some specific ways this act impacted daily life for African Americans?
It's hard to capture the scale of it, really. Before the act, you have to remember, discrimination, segregation, it was everywhere, practically every part of life. Couldn't get served at restaurants, hotels, separate restrooms, water fountains, back of the bus. That was the reality for so many.
Makes you realize how far we've come, but also how bad things were.
It does, and with the Civil Rights Act, suddenly all that becomes illegal. Think about being able to walk into any restaurant, being served, using any public facility, no fear of being turned away. That's huge.
And it went beyond just public spaces, right? Employment, too.
Oh, absolutely. Outlawed discrimination and hiring, firing, promotions based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, all of it.
So it wasn't just opening doors, it was about giving people a real shot at better jobs, economic equality.
Exactly, and the government could actually enforce this now. Withhold funding from places that kept discriminating. Department of Justice could take legal action, hold people accountable.
Real teeth to the law, not just words on paper.
It gave the government the power it needed to break down that system of segregation.
But like we touched on earlier, it wasn't a cure-all. Didn't magically erase all the problems. Right?
No, it didn't. Outlawed legal segregation, sure. But the deep-seated prejudice, racism in society, that didn't vanish overnight. And things like voting rights that took more fighting, more legislation, like the Voting Rights Act a few years later.
So a giant leap forward, but one step on a much longer road.
And that's why it's crucial to look back at all this with nuance, right? Historians have different takes on the act's impact, its legacy. It's not all one simple story.
What are some of those different views?
Well, some historians, they're called traditionalists, they see the Civil Rights Act as the peak of the movement. Johnson's role, getting it passed, that's their focus.
Makes sense. He put so much effort into it.
He did, but then you have continuity historians. They see it as part of a much longer process. The fight for equality, it didn't start or end with this act. It's ongoing.
So more about the big picture, how this fits in over time.
Exactly. Then there's radical historians. They argue that, while important, the act didn't solve everything. Structural inequalities, poverty, mass incarceration, these still hit African Americans harder.
They're saying look beyond the laws to the deeper problems that still need fixing.
That's it. And finally, you've got social historians. They zoom in on the grassroots activism, all the people, the organizations, protests, marches, registering voters. That's what forced change, shifted public opinion.
Reminds us, real change comes from the ground up, everyday people pushing for it.
Couldn't agree more. So, you see, there's no one right way to view the Civil Rights Act. Each perspective adds something to understanding this complicated period.
It's about taking in all those views, the good and the not so good, to really grasp what this act meant.
Exactly. It shows the power of activism, leadership, public opinion changing, but also that the fight for equality, it's never truly over.
What a powerful lesson. And as we wrap up, it makes me think, what does all this mean for us today? How do we take these lessons from the civil rights movement and apply them now?
That's the big question, and honestly, I think it's one each listener needs to wrestle with. What parts of this history speak to you? What can we learn from it to help us fight for social justice in our own time?
That's what it's all about, right? And I think it's crucial to remember. The fight for equality never really ends. It takes constant work, being critical, calling out injustice.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The Civil Rights Act, a huge victory, no doubt, but one step on a long road. And it's up to all of us to keep moving forward towards a fairer, more just world.
This has been an eye-opening deep dive. Really appreciate your insights helping us unpack this crucial part of history.
Glad to be here, and I hope this encourages everyone to keep learning about the civil rights movement. Its legacy shapes us to this day, and understanding it is vital.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. And remember, the fight for equality, it's a marathon, not a sprint. We all have a part to play in building a better world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.